The courthouse was unusually crowded that morning, with every bench filled and the air buzzing with whispers of anticipation. This was no ordinary trial. It wasn't just the defendant seated nervously at the table that drew people in. It was the peculiar presence of a police dog in the courtroom. The K9 sat upright beside its handler, a German shepherd with a sleek coat, intelligent eyes, and a composure that seemed almost human. Its badge gleamed from the harness strapped across its chest, a reminder that this was no pet but an officer of the law, a symbol of loyalty and discipline. But the dog's presence carried a weight that unsettled the room. Jurors shifted in their seats, some curious, others visibly uncomfortable. The courtroom was a place for men and women, laws and arguments. Yet here sat an animal whose role had suddenly blurred the line between evidence and witness. The defense attorneys looked smug, knowing that the dog's reputation alone could sway minds. The prosecution, however, kept stealing glances at the small figure seated at the opposite side of the room. She was the reason everyone had gathered. The little girl couldn't have been older than 8. She sat stiffly on the bench, her tiny shoes swinging inches above the floor. A faded teddy bear rested in her lap, its fur worn thin from years of love. She clutched it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her big eyes scanned the room cautiously, never lingering too long on the dog that had been brought in. She had been told she would need to speak, tell her story to the judge and jury. But for now she sat silently, looking like a child caught between two worlds, the innocent one she belonged to, and the harsh adult world she had been dragged into. The judge entered, his robe swaying, and the murmurs hushed. "This court is now in session," he declared, his gavel striking once against the block. His gaze traveled over the unusual scene. The defendant, pale and anxious, the handlers standing proudly by their decorated K9, the jurors leaning forward with quiet curiosity, and finally, the little girl, who seemed far too small for the burden she carried. Whispers started again when the judge acknowledged the dog's presence. Some saw it as nothing more than part of the case, an expected witness of sorts. Others couldn't help but wonder, what role could a dog play in a trial that involved a child's testimony? The girl's guardian placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, whispering encouragement. She nodded faintly, though her grip on the teddy bear only tightened. It was the only thing in the room that belonged to her, the only shield she had against the sea of eyes waiting to watch her at I end that moment. As silence returned to the courtroom, it became clear that this trial wasn't going to be remembered for its legal intricacies or courtroom strategies. No, it would be remembered for the unlikely confrontation between a little girl and a police dog, two figures on opposite ends of innocence and authority. And though no one could have predicted it yet, the words the child would speak later would shake the courtroom to its very core. When the judge finally called for the first witness, the entire courtroom turned toward the little girl. She sat frozen, her teddy bear clutched so tightly it seemed as if she were afraid it might be taken from her. A bailiff approached gently and extended a hand, but she shook her head and slid off the bench herself, her shoes making a soft tap on the polished floor. Every step toward the witness stand was heavy, as though the weight of dozens of eyes pressed down on her small frame. She climbed onto the chair with some effort, her legs dangling far above the ground. The teddy bear joined her, squeezed against her chest like armor. The judge leaned forward, softening his normally stern tone. "Do you promise to tell the truth?" he asked. The little girl nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. Her guardian, seated nearby, gave her an encouraging smile. The prosecutor, a tall man with kind eyes, crouched slightly so he wouldn't tower over her. His voice was gentle, the kind someone might use with a frightened bird. "Can you tell us your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then whispered it so softly that the court reporter had to lean forward to catch it. The jury smiled faintly at the sound. She was just a child, not the hardened witness one usually expected in such serious cases. Bit by bit, she began to speak. Her words were simple, but her memory sharp. She described the night that had led her here, the flashing lights, the shouting, the fear that had made her hide behind a doorway. Her tiny hands fidgeted with the bear's ear as she spoke, but her eyes stayed focused on the prosecutor, as though he were the only safe anchor in a room full of strangers. At one point, her gaze drifted toward the police dog, sitting beside its handler. Her shoulders stiffened, and her voice faltered. The prosecutor noticed and quickly redirected her back to safer details, but the moment did not go unnoticed. Jurors exchanged glances. The defense attorney scribbled something onto a notepad. The more she spoke, the more the courtroom realized that this was no ordinary testimony. She wasn't here to give legal definitions or point out technicalities. She was here to tell the truth as a child remembered it. Every pause, every hesitant glance carried more weight than polished statements could. Her innocence was her strength, and it made her words strike deeper. When she finished describing the night, the prosecutor gave her a reassuring nod. "You've been very brave," he said. The little girl blinked, as if surprised by the compliment. For the first time since stepping into the room, her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, but the peace of that moment wouldn't last. The defense attorney was already rising from his seat, straightening his tie, preparing to cross-examine. His expression was polite but sharp, his tone firm but calculated. Where the prosecutor had treated her like a child, he would treat her like an unreliable witness. The room tensed again. Everyone knew the hardest questions were about to come, and the small witness, gripping her teddy bear, would soon face her greatest test.
The defense attorney rose with deliberate calm, smoothing the front of his suit as though he had all the time in the world. His polished shoes echoed across the wooden floor as he stepped toward the witness stand. He offered the little girl a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it, only calculation. "Good morning," he said smoothly, adjusting his glasses. "You've been very brave to come here today." His voice dripped with politeness, but those who knew the courtroom dance could hear the blade hidden beneath the silk. The girl didn't answer. She clung to her teddy bear, her knuckles pale. He turned slightly toward the jury, making sure they saw his gentle posture. "Now, we all know children can sometimes get scared, don't we?" he continued. "Scared of things they don't always understand." He looked back at her, lowering his voice to a coaxing tone. "Would you say that's true?" The girl shrugged, unsure how to answer. He smiled again as though her silence confirmed his point. "Exactly. Sometimes," he pressed on, "we think we see monsters in the dark. Isn't that right?" The jury shifted. A few frowned. The prosecutor started to object, but the judge allowed the questioning to continue. The attorney circled the stand slowly, his eyes glancing toward the police dog seated calmly by its handler. "You see, this dog here," he gestured toward the animal, "isn't a monster at all. He's a trained officer, a professional, loyal, disciplined, and awarded for his service. Isn't that right, Officer Daniels?" The handler stood and gave a firm nod. "Yes, sir. Rex has served 3 years without incident." The defense attorney spread his arms wide, turning to the jury. 3 years without incident. Not one complaint. Not one mistake. This is a decorated K-9 officer, ladies and gentlemen, not the villain of a bedtime story. He turned back to the child, softening his tone again. "Sweetheart, when you saw Rex that night, were you maybe just frightened by his bark? Dogs bark, don't they? That doesn't mean they're bad. You have pets at home, don't you? The little girl shook her head. No pets, no dogs, just silence. The attorney's smile faltered for a second, but he recovered quickly. Well then, perhaps you simply misunderstood what you saw. It was late, it was dark, people were shouting. Things can seem scarier than they really are. He glanced back at the jury, letting his words sink in. Children, as we know, don't always see things the way adults do. The little girl's lips trembled. Her teddy bear looked as if it might burst from the pressure of her grip. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The defense attorney, satisfied with her silence, gave a final nod. No further questions, Your Honor. He returned to his seat with quiet confidence, certain he had planted seeds of doubt in the jury's minds. But as the girl sat there, her wide eyes drifting once more toward the dog, something unspoken lingered in the room, an unease that even the most polished argument couldn't erase.
The defense attorney's polished words still lingered in the air as he returned to his seat, his expression one of quiet triumph. The jury scribbled notes, some nodding slightly, others looking uncertain. The handler rested his hand on the German shepherd's harness, calm and confident, while the dog remained perfectly still, its ears pricked, its dark eyes unreadable. The prosecutor rose slowly, his face composed but his mind racing. He knew the defense had played well, painting the girl's fear as nothing more than childish imagination. Yet he also knew the truth that lived in her trembling hands and her eyes that couldn't leave the dog for long. Did he approach the witness stand again, lowering his voice so it carried gentleness rather than challenge. "You've done so well," he said, smiling warmly at the child. "I know this is hard, but you're helping us understand what really happened that night." The girl shifted slightly, clutching her teddy bear tighter, her legs swinging nervously above the ground. She didn't answer, but her eyes flicked to him with a hint of trust. He paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch, then asked a question so simple, yet so dangerous. "Can you show us who was there that night? The one you remember most clearly?" The courtroom went still. Even the ceiling fan seemed to hush. Everyone assumed he wanted her to point toward the defendant or perhaps the handler. The defense attorney leaned back smugly, confident this would end in nothing significant. But the little girl's eyes moved across the room. First, she glanced at the defendant, but her gaze passed quickly, as though he were a shadow in the memory rather than the source of it. Then her eyes landed on the handler, but again they slid past. Finally, they settled, steady and unwavering, on the one figure no one expected. The dog, her hand, small and shaking, lifted from the teddy bear. She pointed. Gasps erupted across the room. A few jurors exchanged startled looks. Even the judge leaned forward, eyebrows raised, as though questioning whether he had truly seen what just happened. The handler stiffened, glancing down at his canine partner, whose tail thumped lightly against the floor, oblivious to the accusation. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection!" he barked, his voice louder than he intended. "This is outrageous. She's a child. Pointing at a dog means nothing." The judge silenced him with a raised hand, but did not hide his own bewilderment. His gavel hovered above the block, but didn't fall. He, too, wanted to hear what the child had to say. All eyes returned to her. The prosecutor crouched again, his tone careful, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Sweetheart, why are you pointing at the dog?" The girl swallowed hard. Her teddy slipped slightly in her lap as she steadied her trembling arm. The silence was unbearable, thick with expectation. The jury leaned forward, waiting. The handler shifted uncomfortably, gripping the harness tighter. And then, in a voice so small yet so certain, she prepared to speak the words that would soon unravel everything. For a long, breathless moment, the courtroom was frozen. The little girl's arm remained raised, her tiny finger pointing directly at the police dog. No one moved. No one spoke. The stillness was so deep that even the shuffle of papers or the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to vanish. The jury sat wide-eyed, caught between disbelief and curiosity. Some leaned forward, straining to catch the slightest sound. Others glanced at one another as if to silently confirm what they had just seen. A child pointing at a decorated police dog? It felt absurd, impossible. Yet the weight of her gesture filled the room. The German shepherd shifted slightly, letting out a soft exhale through its nose. Its handler tightened his grip on the harness, his jaw stiff. He had been in dozens of trials, but never had his K9 been treated as anything more than a badge of honor, a symbol of justice. Now, under the unflinching stare of a child, his partner looked suddenly vulnerable. The defense attorney was the first to break the silence. He leapt to his feet, outrage spilling from every word. "Your Honor, this is nonsense. She's a frightened child, nothing more. Pointing at a dog has no bearing on this case." His voice rang through the chamber, sharp and desperate, echoing louder than he had intended. The judge raised his hand calmly, silencing him without a word. His stern gaze lingered on the girl. "Let the witness finish," he said firmly. The defense attorney sank back into his chair, seething. The handler's eyes darted between the judge and the jury, then down at his dog, who remained calm, tongue lolling slightly as if blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around it. The prosecutor crouched low, making sure his eyes were level with the girl's. He spoke softly, like one might to a child hiding under the covers during a thunderstorm. "You pointed at the dog," he said gently. "Can you tell us why?" The girl blinked. Her lips trembled as she clutched her teddy bear closer. She opened her mouth, but no words came. For a moment, it seemed as if fear might choke her voice entirely. She glanced at the jurors, then at the judge, then back at the dog. Her chest rose and fell quickly. The way it does when someone is holding back tears, the silence grew unbearable. A cough from the back of the gallery was enough to make half the room flinch. The tension was no longer invisible. It was heavy, pressing down on every person present. Even the jurors, hardened by days of legal arguments, now sat motionless, caught between pity for the child and the shocking possibility of what she might say finally. Her small voice broke the silence. It was barely more than a whisper, yet it carried through the room with startling clarity. "Because," she began, her eyes locked on the dog. She hesitated, gathering the courage only children possess in their purest honesty. Every breath in the room caught, waiting for her next words, and then, with trembling lips, she uttered 2 words that would echo through the courtroom and change everything. The courtroom held its breath. Every eye stayed fixed on the little girl, who sat trembling in the witness chair, her teddy bear clutched against her chest like a shield. Her finger still pointed toward the police dog, though her hand wavered slightly from nerves. She swallowed hard, and at last the words slipped out. "Bad dog." She whispered 2 small words, but they struck the room like a thunderclap. The silence afterward was deafening. For a moment, it seemed the entire courthouse had forgotten how to breathe. The judge blinked, leaning forward slightly, as though his ears had deceived him. The court reporter's fingers hovered above the keys, frozen in midair. The jury sat in stunned silence, their pens dangling over notebooks, caught between disbelief and a dawning sense of something far heavier, The defense attorney reacted first, shooting to his feet with theatrical outrage. "Objection!" he shouted, his voice cracking with both anger and panic. "This is ridiculous. She's a frightened child accusing a dog. A dog. These words mean nothing." His hand spread dramatically toward the jurors, but his tone betrayed something else. Fear. The judge raised his gavel, but didn't strike it. He was watching the child, not the lawyer. "Overruled," he said quietly. His voice carried an unusual weight, as though he, too, felt the gravity of her words. The prosecutor crouched down again, his face soft with encouragement. "Can you tell us why you said that?" he asked gently. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away from the animal. Her voice shook as she spoke, but it was steady enough to pierce the silence. Because it growled at me," she said. "It barked, and its teeth were out, and I thought it was going to bite me. It scared me." She buried her face briefly in her teddy before peeking out again. "Bad dog." Gasps rippled through the audience. The words weren't sophisticated. They weren't dramatic, but they were raw, innocent, and unfiltered. The truth as a child understood it. The handler shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening around the harness. The German shepherd sat calmly, ears perked, tail tapping lightly against the floor. To anyone else, it looked like the perfect picture of loyalty and obedience. But to the little girl, it was a reminder of fear, a living symbol of the night she could not forget. The defense attorney tried to recover, pacing in frustration. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is nothing more than a child's fear," he insisted, his voice desperate now. "Children are frightened by shadows, by storms, by loud noises. That doesn't mean the dog did anything wrong." But his words rang hollow compared to the trembling testimony of the girl. The jury didn't see a rehearsed performance. They saw honesty in its purest form. A child who couldn't lie if she tried. A child who called things exactly as she saw them. Bad dog. 2 words, simple yet devastating, hung in the air. And for the first time, the untouchable reputation of the K-9 officer seemed fragile. The words still echoed in the room. Bad dog. They were childlike, almost laughably simple, but no one was laughing. The jurors sat rigid in their seats, their faces etched with unease. What they had heard was not the polished argument of a lawyer or the rehearsed statement of an expert. It was the unfiltered truth of a child, delivered without guile or agenda. The prosecutor remained crouched near the girl, letting the weight of her words settle in the jury's minds. He didn't need to embellish them. He didn't need to twist them. The power was in their raw simplicity. The defense attorney, however, was unraveling. He rose again, his voice sharper than before, his tone cracking under pressure. "Members of the jury, you must understand, this is fear talking, not fact. A frightened child misinterpreted what she saw. The dog barked, yes, but barking is not aggression. Barking is communication. You cannot condemn a decorated K-9 officer on the shaky words of a child." He gestured dramatically toward the dog, who sat with perfect composure, tail resting on the floor, tongue flicking in and out with calm indifference. To the handler, this was proof of his partner's discipline. To the jurors, though, the contrast between the innocent child trembling in her seat and the stoic animal sitting silently seemed suddenly jarring. One juror, a middle-aged woman, frowned deeply as she scribbled something in her notebook. Another leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his lip, his eyes fixed on the dog with suspicion rather than admiration. The seed of doubt had been planted. The judge himself shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had presided over countless cases, but this one felt different. Courtrooms were places of evidence and logic. Yet here, Emotion was shaping the truth. A little girl's trembling voice carried more force than the most meticulous legal arguments. He found himself wondering, if justice ignored the smallest, most vulnerable voices, was it really justice at all? The handler tried to salvage his dog's reputation. "Your Honor, with respect, Rex has been trained to protect, to defend. He has never harmed an innocent person. The girl is mistaken." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed worry. He knew better than anyone that even the best trained dogs could have moments of instinctive aggression, moments handlers prayed would never be exposed. The girl hugged her teddy tighter, her eyes never leaving the dog. To her, the courtroom wasn't about procedures or legal definitions. It was about memory, terrifying, vivid, undeniable memory. And that memory told her the dog had been bad. The jury couldn't shake it. In the sterile world of evidence and testimony, her two words had cut through the noise, like lightning in a storm. Suddenly, the decorated K9 wasn't an untouchable hero, but a suspect in the story. A creature capable of fear, aggression, and mistakes. The defense attorney slumped into his chair, his earlier confidence drained. For the first time, it seemed the case was slipping from his control, and all it took was the simple honesty of a child. The courtroom felt heavier than ever as the little girl's words lingered in the air. Bad dog. 2 syllables had shaken the foundations of a trial that had seemed straightforward only hours before. The jury no longer looked certain. The judge no longer looked immovable. Even the defense attorney, who had strutted with confidence at the start, now sat pale and restless, shuffling through his notes as though the right words might suddenly appear on the page. The prosecutor stood tall, his voice calm but firm as he delivered his closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about technicalities, badges, or the prestige of a uniform, human or canine. It is about truth. A child, with no agenda, no rehearsed speech, pointed at what she remembered. She didn't accuse because she wanted to win. She accused because she remembered fear. We cannot ignore that voice simply because it is small." He paused, letting the jurors absorb the words. Sometimes, justice is found not in the powerful, but in the powerless. The defense attorney rose next, his voice tight with urgency. He reminded the jury of the dog's spotless record, the handler's testimony, the years of service Rex had given. He painted the girl's memory as fragile, twisted by fear and misunderstanding. "We cannot let the emotional words of a child outweigh years of proven service," he urged. "The truth is clear. This dog is not guilty of wrongdoing. Fear does not equal fact." Yet his voice lacked the conviction it once had. It trembled where before it had been smooth, faltered where before it had flowed. The jurors noticed. The judge gave his instructions, then dismissed the jury to deliberate. The room emptied into tense silence, broken only by the faint scratching of the handler's hand as he petted Rex's head. The girl sat quietly with her guardian, her teddy bear resting against her cheek. She looked exhausted, her small body slumping after carrying such a heavy weight. Hours passed before the jury returned. Their faces were solemn, their steps measured. The foreman handed the folded paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. He opened it slowly, scanning the words before looking up. "In the matter of this case," he began, his voice steady, "the jury finds," he paused, not for effect, but because he felt the weight of the decision, "that the testimony of the child raises reasonable doubt about the conduct of the K9 officer and his handler. Therefore, the court cannot proceed with full confidence in the reliability of the defense's argument." Gasps swept through the courtroom. It wasn't a dramatic conviction or a sweeping acquittal. It was doubt, Clear and undeniable, carved into the record. The handler lowered his gaze, his grip on Rex's harness tightening. The defense attorney sat back heavily, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The prosecutor simply nodded, knowing the child had spoken more truth than all the lawyers combined. As the judge dismissed the court, all eyes turned once more to the little girl. She stood, clutching her teddy bear, her voice too tired to speak again. She didn't need to. Her 2 words had already changed everything, and long after the courtroom emptied, people would remember that trial, not for the arguments of the lawyers, nor the authority of the dog, but for the courage of a child who dared to whisper the truth. When the gavel struck for the final time, signaling the end of the trial, the courtroom emptied slowly, as though no one wanted to be the first to leave. The air still buzzed with the shock of what had just unfolded. Lawyers whispered to one another in the hallway. Reporters scribbled furiously into notepads, and townspeople who had crowded into the gallery filed out with wide eyes, already rehearsing how they would tell the story once they returned home. The little girl left quietly, her guardian's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. She held her teddy bear tightly, its faded fur damp with the sweat of her palms. She hadn't understood the legal details, nor the murmurs of reasonable doubt and procedural review. What she did understand was simpler. She had told the truth, and for once, the adults had listened. Outside the courthouse, the summer air felt different. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions not at the lawyers, but at the handler, who stood stiffly with his decorated K9 by his side. Rex, the German shepherd, looked majestic in the sunlight, yet the whispers of the crowd carried unease. "That's the dog," someone muttered. "The one she called bad." The handler tugged at the leash, his face flushed with frustration. For years, Rex had been a symbol of pride. Now, his reputation was stained by the fragile voice of a child. The defense attorney avoided the press entirely, slipping away through a side door, his once sure stride faltering. The prosecutor, on the other hand, stopped only briefly, telling the crowd, "Justice isn't always about certainty. It's about listening, even when the truth comes from the smallest among us." His words were carried in the next morning's papers and the weeks that followed. Debates erupted across the town and beyond. Some people defended Rex fiercely, insisting a child's fear should not undo years of service. Others argued that blind trust in authority, whether human or canine, was dangerous, and that the girl's testimony had been a rare moment of honesty cutting through the noise of procedure. The girl herself returned to her quiet routines. She played with her toys, drew pictures with crayons, and held her teddy at night when sleep was hard to find. Yet she was different now. Though young, she had carried a truth that adults had tried to dismiss, and she had refused to let go of it. In her own small way, she had stood against the current. Months later, people still talked about the trial. They remembered the polished speeches, the heated objections, the stern gavel of the judge. But most of all, they remembered the moment a little girl pointed at a police dog and spoke 2 simple words. "Bad dog." 2 words that became more than an accusation. They became a reminder that even the strongest symbols could be questioned, and that sometimes the voice of a child carried more weight than the roar of a courtroom. And in that legacy, her truth lived on.
Years passed before the little girl, no longer so little, fully understood what had happened in that courthouse. At the time, she remembered only the weight of stairs, the coldness of the wooden chair beneath her legs, and the pounding of her heart when she whispered those 2 words, "Bad dog." But as she grew older, those moments returned in sharper focus, reshaped by the understanding that came with age. In her town, the trial never faded from memory. It became a touchstone, whispered about in diners, classrooms, and on courthouse steps. For some, it was a tale of misplaced fear, how a child's trembling words nearly tarnished a decorated canine's reputation. For others, it was a story of courage, how innocence had pierced through authority and reminded everyone that justice must listen to every voice, no matter how small. The police department itself changed, quietly at first, then openly. Training sessions were revised, with new protocols focusing on how canine units engaged with the public, especially children. Officers were reminded that symbols of authority carried great power, and with power came the responsibility to ensure safety, not fear. Rex eventually retired, his reputation complicated but not erased. To some, he remained a hero. To others, he was a reminder that even heroes could be questioned. The girl, meanwhile, carried the memory like a scar. Not always painful, but never invisible. In her teenage years, she would catch sight of police dogs at fairs or community events and feel her chest tighten, an echo of the fear she'd once felt. But she also carried something else: pride. Pride that, even in her trembling voice, she had spoken truth when no one expected her to. By the time she reached adulthood, she pursued studies in law and psychology, fascinated by how memory, fear, and truth collided in courtrooms. Professors who learned her story marveled at how such a formative moment had shaped her path. She, however, simply saw it as unfinished business, the continuation of a story that had begun when she pointed her finger at a dog and dared to speak. The case itself was still cited in legal discussions, not because of its verdict, but because of its symbolism. Judges and attorneys referenced it when debating the weight of child testimony, the role of emotion in law, and the trust placed in authority figures, human or otherwise. Law students read summaries of it, and in lecture halls, her two words were repeated again and again as examples of how truth often arrived in unexpected forms. And for the girl, now a young woman, those words still belonged to her. They were not the end of her story, but the beginning. Because in a world that often dismissed the voices of the powerless, she had proven something extraordinary. Sometimes justice begins not with a gavel or a badge, but with the trembling courage of a child who refuses to stay silent. Her truth had echoed far beyond that courthouse, and it would echo still.